Most men are taught to admire emotional depth until they actually meet a woman who can see straight through them. A female empath doesn't just hear words, she reads hesitation. She notices emotional inconsistencies. She feels tension before it's spoken. And for many men, that level of emotional exposure feels terrifying. Not because she's toxic, but because she activates parts of them they've spent years hiding. Here's the psychology script. A female empath is dangerous to emotionally immature men for one simple reason: she forces authenticity. And most people are not prepared to be emotionally naked in front of someone who can detect lies, emotional manipulation, and hidden intentions almost instantly. The first reason most men can't handle a female empath is because she reads emotional patterns faster than words. Neuroscience shows that highly empathetic people often possess stronger mirror neuron activity, meaning they subconsciously pick up facial microexpressions, tone shifts, and emotional inconsistencies before the logical brain even processes them. A normal conversation for her is psychological surveillance. She notices the fake confidence, the rehearsed stories, the emotional avoidance, and many men feel exposed around her without understanding why. Suddenly the charm stops working. The performance collapses, and the man realizes she's responding to who he really is, not who he's pretending to be. That creates psychological pressure, because most men were conditioned to hide weakness. Society teaches men that vulnerability is dangerous. So when an empath calmly notices pain beneath the surface, it feels invasive. Not because she attacked him, but because she saw what he wanted hidden. The second reason is that female empaths create emotional accountability. Most relationships survive on partial truth, small emotional games, strategic silence, passive manipulation. But an empath struggles to tolerate emotional dishonesty because her nervous system constantly absorbs tension. Research in psychology shows that emotionally perceptive people experience higher stress responses when exposed to unresolved conflict or deception. In other words, she physically feels emotional imbalance. That's why she asks difficult questions. That's why she notices energy changes immediately. And that's why emotionally avoidant men often pull away from her. She, nationally becomes a mirror reflecting the parts of themselves they've avoided confronting for years. And here's the uncomfortable truth. A man can dominate conversations, control social situations, even appear powerful to everyone else, but still feel psychologically weak in front of an empathic woman because she's responding to his emotional state instead of his image. The third reason most men can't handle a female empath is because she values emotional depth more than status. Many men build identity around achievement, money, attention, or external validation. But an empath is often drawn toward emotional congruence. She cares less about performance and more about emotional safety, sincerity, and internal stability. That confuses men who rely heavily on status-based attraction, because suddenly their usual tools stop working. The expensive lifestyle doesn't impress her if the emotional energy feels unstable. The confident persona doesn't matter if she senses insecurity underneath, and for some men, that rejection of superficial value systems feels deeply threatening to the ego. Psychologists call this identity destabilization. When the traits a person depends on for validation, we stop producing emotional control, anxiety increases. That's why some men become defensive, dismissive, or emotionally aggressive around empathic women. She unintentionally removes their psychological armor. The fourth reason is that female empaths trigger unresolved childhood wounds. This is where things become intense. Many emotionally sensitive women naturally take on nurturing emotional roles. They listen deeply. They comfort naturally. They create emotional safety. But for men carrying unresolved attachment trauma, that level of emotional closeness activates fear instead of peace. Suddenly they become distant, confused, overwhelmed, not because the connection is weak, but because it feels too real. Attachment theory explains this perfectly. People with avoidant attachment styles often crave intimacy subconsciously while simultaneously fearing emotional dependency. So when an empath offers genuine emotional connection, the nervous system interprets it as danger. The result is emotional withdrawal, inconsistency, or self-sabotage. That's why some men chase empathic women intensely, then panic when the relationship becomes emotionally intimate. The fifth reason most men can't Handle a female empath is because she notices manipulation immediately. Empaths spend years studying emotional energy unconsciously. They become experts in behavioral inconsistencies. They notice when compliments feel transactional. They sense emotional coercion. They recognize guilt tactics and subtle dominance games quickly. And manipulators hate awareness, because manipulation only works when the target doubts their own perception. A female empath often survives emotionally difficult experiences precisely because her intuition becomes hyper-developed. Trauma research even shows that people exposed to emotionally unpredictable environments can become highly skilled at detecting emotional shifts as a survival mechanism. She learned to read people because at some point, reading people was emotional protection. And this creates a problem for emotionally dishonest men, because she's not reacting to their words. She's reacting to what their nervous system communicates underneath the words. The sixth reason is emotional intensity. Female empaths don't experience relationships casually. Their nervous systems absorb emotional experiences deeply. Love affects them deeply. Betrayal, according to, affects them deeply. Conflict affects them deeply. And many men are simply not emotionally trained to handle that level of emotional presence. Modern culture encourages emotional suppression in men from childhood. Be strong. Don't cry. Man up. The result is emotional underdevelopment disguised as masculinity. So when an empath communicates intense emotional truth, many men interpret it as too much because they were never taught emotional regulation. They confuse emotional depth with emotional instability. But there's a difference. Emotional instability is chaos without awareness. Emotional depth is awareness without emotional numbness. The seventh reason most men can't handle a female empath is because she eventually stops tolerating emotional starvation. This is critical. Empaths often begin relationships by overgiving. They nurture, support, heal, understand. They absorb emotional burdens others avoid. But eventually their nervous system burns out. And when an empath emotionally detaches, it shocks people, because she doesn't usually leave impulsively. She leaves after months or years of emotional exhaustion. Psychologists refer to this as compassion fatigue. When Donald giving becomes one-sided for too long, the brain begins emotionally protecting itself through detachment. That's why the quiet withdrawal of an empath feels so cold and sudden to others. But internally, she checked out long before she physically left. And many men don't realize the relationship ended emotionally until her empathy disappears completely. Most men think attraction begins with beauty, but with a female empath, attraction begins with exposure. The moment she enters a room, something unusual happens. People feel psychologically visible around her, not because she says much, not because she demands attention, but because her nervous system notices what other people ignore: the forced smile, the fake confidence, the tension hidden beneath someone's voice. And science suggests this ability may be more real than most people realize. Researchers studying emotional intelligence and mirror neurons discovered that highly empathetic individuals often process emotional cues at extraordinary speeds. Tiny facial expressions lasting less than a second, changes in breathing, patterns, subtle voice fluctuations, all become emotional data to the empathic brain. While most people we, our words, an empath unconsciously listens to the nervous system behind the words. That means a man can rehearse the perfect sentence, wear the perfect clothes, project the perfect image, and still feel strangely uncomfortable around her because she reacts to what he feels, not what he performs. And that terrifies people who built their identity around performance, because most men are trained from childhood to hide emotional weakness. Boys learn early that vulnerability can cost respect. Crying becomes shameful. Fear becomes silence. Pain becomes aggression. Over time, many men develop what psychologists call emotional masking, the habit of suppressing authentic emotions to appear stronger, calmer, or more dominant than they actually feel. But suppression comes with consequences. Research from Harvard and Stanford has repeatedly linked chronic emotional suppression to increased stress hormones, anxiety disorders, cardiovascular strain, and even weakened immune function. In simple terms, pretending to be emotionally invincible slowly damages the body. Now imagine standing in front of someone who senses that hidden emotional pressure instantly. That is why female empaths often Wake, emotionally disconnected men feel uneasy without saying a single threatening word. Her presence disrupts emotional camouflage. Suddenly, the man notices his own nervousness. He becomes hyper-aware of his inconsistencies. He wonders why his charm isn't landing the same way it usually does. And for the first time in years, he feels psychologically examined instead of admired. This is why some men become defensive around empathic women almost immediately. They may call her too intense, too observant, too emotional. But those labels are often psychological defense mechanisms. Because the empath is not creating insecurity, she's exposing insecurity that already existed beneath the surface. Neuroscientists have found that the human brain reacts to emotional exposure similarly to physical danger. When someone feels emotionally seen, the amygdala, the brain's fear center, can activate as if facing a real threat. Heart rate increases. Cortisol rises. The body prepares for protection. That means emotional honesty is biologically uncomfortable for people who spent years avoiding it. And a female empath unintentionally creates that discomfort simply through emotional awareness. But here's where things become even darker. Many men do not realize how disconnected they are from their own emotions until they encounter someone emotionally intuitive. Modern culture rewards emotional performance more than emotional truth. Social media teaches people how to appear confident, successful, desirable, powerful. But emotional authenticity is rarely practiced. Studies now show that loneliness, depression, and emotional isolation among men have reached crisis levels globally. Despite appearing socially connected online, millions of men report feeling emotionally unseen in real life. Then an empath enters their life, and suddenly someone notices the exhaustion behind the confidence. Someone notices the sadness hidden beneath the jokes. Someone notices the emotional emptiness they themselves stopped acknowledging years ago. That level of emotional recognition can feel healing, but it can also feel terrifying, because healing requires honesty. And honesty forces confrontation with unresolved pain. This is why emotionally immature men often pull away from empathic women after periods of intense connection. At first, the empath feels intoxicating. She listens deeply. She understands quickly. She creates emotional safety that many men secretly crave their entire lives. But eventually the relationship stops feeling like fantasy and starts feeling like emotional accountability. The empath notices contradictions. She asks deeper questions. She senses emotional avoidance. And the man faces a choice: evolve emotionally or retreat into emotional protection. Many retreat. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort experienced when a person's self-image conflicts with reality. A man may believe he's emotionally strong, self-aware, and authentic, but an empath's perception quietly challenges that belief. Suddenly he realizes how much of his life has been performance instead of connection, and not everyone has the psychological strength to confront that realization, because facing yourself is harder than facing another person. And female empaths accidentally force that confrontation. What makes this even more powerful is that empaths themselves often don't fully understand what they're doing. Many empathic women spent years being told they were too sensitive, too emotional, too affected by other people's energy. But sensitivity is not weakness. Sensitivity is heightened information processing. Research shows highly sensitive nervous systems absorb more environmental detail than average brains. That means the empath is not imagining emotional tension, she is neurologically detecting more of it. Her brain notices what others filter out. That's why crowded rooms exhaust her. That's why fake people drain her energy. That's why emotionally dishonest conversations leave her physically tired. Her nervous system is constantly scanning emotional environments for congruence and threat. And ironically, the very gift that makes her deeply compassionate also makes relationships incredibly difficult with emotionally disconnected people. Because the empath does not fall in love with appearances for long. Eventually, she begins searching for emotional consistency. She studies behavior patterns. She notices whether words align with actions. She senses whether affection feels genuine or manipulative. And manipulative individuals often panic around emotionally perceptive people because manipulation survives through confusion. An empath reduces confusion. That is her power. She sees emotional patterns clearly. enough to disrupt emotional games, and many men mistake that clarity for intimidation. But the truth is, emotionally healthy men are rarely threatened by empathic women. In fact, psychological studies show emotionally intelligent individuals are more comfortable with vulnerability, self-reflection, and emotional communication. A mature man does not feel exposed by emotional honesty because he is not dependent on emotional masks for identity. He does not fear being emotionally seen because he already sees himself clearly. That is the difference. Weak men fear exposure. Strong men value authenticity. And this explains why female empaths often experience extreme relationship patterns. Emotionally avoidant people are intensely attracted to them at first because empathy feels safe, nurturing, and emotionally addictive. But once the empath begins seeing beneath the surface, the avoidant person often withdraws to protect unresolved emotional wounds. It becomes a tragic cycle. The empath tries to understand deeper. The emotionally disconnected partner tries to hide deeper, and eventually both become exhausted. But here is the lesson most female empaths must eventually learn. Why? Our ability to see emotional truth is not a curse. It is psychological awareness in a world built on emotional performance. The goal is not to shut down your intuition. The goal is to stop offering emotional access to people terrified of honesty, because not everyone wants healing. Some people only want comfort, and comfort allows masks to survive, but empathy exposes masks. That is why your presence changes people. That is why emotionally dishonest individuals either attack you, fear you, or disappear from your life entirely. And that is why a true empath eventually realizes something heartbreaking but liberating at the same time. The people most disturbed by your emotional awareness are often the people hiding the most pain from themselves. Most men don't fear female empaths because they are too emotional. They fear them because empaths demand something modern society trained many men to avoid completely: emotional depth. And the terrifying part is that most men don't even realize they are emotionally disconnected until they meet a woman who forces them to feel again. From childhood, boys are taught a dangerous psychological survival strategy. Stay calm, stay hard, stay in control, never cry too much, never appear weak, never admit fear. Over time, the male nervous system adapts to emotional suppression so deeply that many men lose connection with their own emotional reality. Psychologists call this normative male alexithymia, a condition where individuals struggle to identify, process, or express emotions because society conditioned emotional shutdown as masculine behavior. And the health consequences are horrifying. Research has repeatedly linked emotional suppression in men to higher risks of depression, addiction, aggression, sleep disorders, heart disease, and even shortened life expectancy. One major study found that chronically suppressing emotions increases stress hormone activity inside the body, forcing the nervous system into prolonged survival mode. In simple terms, millions of men are walking through life emotionally armored while their bodies quietly absorb the damage. Then suddenly, they meet a female empath, a woman who notices emotional pain without words, a woman who senses exhaustion hidden behind confidence, a woman who asks questions most people avoid asking. And for the first time in years, the emotional walls begin cracking. At first, it feels intoxicating, because emotionally neglected people become addicted to emotional safety the moment they experience it. Neuroscience shows that genuine emotional connection activates reward systems in the brain similar to addictive substances. Oxytocin rises, dopamine increases, cortisol temporarily drops. The body relaxes around authentic emotional intimacy because human beings are biologically wired for connection. That's why so many men become intensely attached to empathic women early on. She listens differently. She notices differently. She understands pain most people dismiss. Around her, a man feels emotionally visible instead of emotionally judged. But then something changes. The relationship becomes deeper. And depth is where fear begins. Because emotional depth is not just romance. Emotional depth means accountability, vulnerability, exposure, self-awareness. It means confronting unresolved trauma instead of hiding it behind distractions, anger, work, sex, status, or silence. And many men have spent their entire lives avoiding exactly that confrontation. This is where attachment psychology becomes critical. Researchers studying attachment theory discovered that emotionally avoidant individuals often crave intimacy subconsciously while simultaneously fearing it consciously. They want connection, but panic when connection becomes emotionally real. Why? Because deep intimacy activates buried emotional wounds formed during childhood. Rejection, abandonment, criticism, emotional neglect, trauma the nervous system never fully processed. And female empaths unintentionally trigger all of it. Not because they are manipulative, not because they are toxic, but because emotional closeness forces hidden pain to rise to the surface. This explains one of the most confusing relationship patterns in modern psychology. A man pursues the empath intensely in the beginning. He calls constantly, opens up emotionally, talks about the future, feels addicted to the connection. But the deeper the emotional bond becomes, the more anxious and distant he suddenly acts. To the empath, it feels confusing. To psychology, it makes perfect sense. The avoidant nervous system interprets emotional dependency as danger. The moment emotional intimacy threatens the emotional armor protecting unresolved wounds, the brain activates survival. Responses: withdrawal, emotional shutdown, irritability, numbness, self-sabotage. The person unconsciously pulls away to regain emotional control. And this is where female empaths suffer the most, because empathic women often internalize the emotional withdrawal of others. Their nervous systems naturally scan for emotional imbalance. They notice energy changes immediately: the shorter texts, the emotional distance, the colder tone of voice. And because empaths feel emotional disconnection intensely, they often try harder to repair the bond. They over-explain, over-give, over-understand, over-forgive. But the tragic reality is this: you cannot heal emotional avoidance by offering more love to someone terrified of vulnerability. In fact, studies on emotionally avoidant behavior show that excessive emotional pursuit can increase withdrawal responses in avoidant individuals because intimacy itself feels psychologically overwhelming. And here's the devastating truth many empaths eventually discover. The issue was never that they were too much. The issue was that the other person lacked the emotional capacity to meet them at depth. Modern culture rewards surface-level connection. BECDON. Fast attraction. Quick validation. Emotional convenience. But emotional depth requires nervous system maturity. It requires self-awareness. And most people are emotionally untrained. This is why emotionally deep conversations exhaust some men. Their nervous systems are unfamiliar with sustained vulnerability. Brain imaging studies show emotionally suppressed individuals often experience higher stress activation during emotionally intimate discussions because the brain interprets vulnerability as threat exposure rather than safety. Think about that for a moment. For some people, being emotionally honest literally feels dangerous. And a female empath unintentionally creates that danger because she sees through emotional performance. She notices when "I'm fine" really means emotional exhaustion. She notices when anger is actually sadness. She notices when emotional numbness is hiding fear. And many men panic when someone accurately identifies emotions they themselves cannot process. This is also why empathic women are often called too sensitive by emotionally unavailable people. But sensitivity is not weakness. Emotional sensitivity is heightened emotional awareness. Research on highly sensitive individuals shows they process emotional stimuli more deeply than average nervous systems. Their brains literally absorb more emotional information from facial expressions, tone shifts, and social environments. That means the empath is not imagining emotional tension. She is detecting emotional information others ignore. But sadly, emotionally disconnected people often interpret emotional awareness as emotional intensity because they spent their lives avoiding emotional reality altogether. And the long-term damage of emotional avoidance is enormous. Studies show chronic emotional suppression increases loneliness, relationship dissatisfaction, substance abuse, and emotional isolation. Many emotionally avoidant men appear functional externally while internally feeling disconnected from themselves, their relationships, and even their own purpose. Then they meet an empath, and suddenly they feel everything again: the pain, the loneliness, the grief, the fear. the longing for connection they buried beneath years of emotional survival. And instead of recognizing the empath as a mirror revealing emotional truth, many run from her because facing himself feels unbearable. This creates one of the saddest dynamics in relationships. The empath mistakes emotional withdrawal as proof she must love harder. The avoidant partner mistakes emotional intimacy as loss of control, and both slowly drown in misunderstanding. But here is the deeper lesson every empath eventually learns. You cannot build emotional safety with someone addicted to emotional avoidance. Real love requires emotional presence. Real intimacy requires nervous system regulation. Real connection requires the courage to be emotionally seen without hiding behind masks. And emotionally mature men understand this. A healthy man does not fear emotional depth because he has already confronted his own emotions internally. He does not need to dominate conversations, suppress vulnerability, or emotionally disappear when intimacy increases. Psychological research consistently shows emotionally intelligent men experience healthier relationships, lower stress levels, stronger communication skills, and greater long-term happiness. Because emotional awareness is not weakness, it is emotional strength without emotional denial. And this is the truth female empaths stop apologizing for. You are not difficult because you crave depth. You are not too emotional because you value honesty. You are not asking for too much when you desire emotional consistency, communication, and authentic connection. You are simply incompatible with people committed to emotional escape, because eventually every empath discovers something life-changing. People who fear emotional depth are not protecting themselves from you. They are protecting themselves from the emotions your presence forces them to feel. The most dangerous thing about a female empath is not her beauty, not her sensitivity, not even her intuition. It's the fact that she cannot be controlled by superficial value for long. Most men spend years learning how to impress women. Status, money, charm, social dominance, attention, appearance. They master attraction strategies because modern society teaches men that external success creates emotional power. And for a while, it works. But then they meet a female empath, and suddenly none of the usual tactics feel effective anymore. Because an empath is not emotionally attached to performance. She is emotionally attached to congruence. She pays attention to energy more than image. She notices emotional stability more than social status. She studies behavior patterns more than words. And that creates psychological panic in people whose identity depends entirely on external validation. This is where science becomes terrifyingly revealing. Psychologists have found that human beings constantly perform social masking behaviors to gain approval, attraction, and status. In fact, studies on self-presentation theory show that most people unconsciously modify personality traits, emotional expressions, and behaviors depending on who they are around. The average person spends enormous mental energy maintaining an image acceptable to society. But empaths notice the cracks in the performance. They notice when confidence feels rehearsed. They notice when generosity hides insecurity. They notice when charm feels emotionally empty. And because they value emotional truth over social appearance, many men experience something deeply uncomfortable around them: powerlessness. For some men, status is identity. Money becomes identity. Attention becomes identity. Being admired becomes identity. But when an empath responds to emotional energy instead of external symbols, those identity structures begin collapsing psychologically. And that collapse can trigger enormous insecurity. Research in behavioral psychology shows that when people lose access to their primary source of validation, the brain often reacts with stress responses similar to physical survival threats. Cortisol increases. Anxiety rises. Defensive behaviors intensify. Why? Because the ego interprets rejection of its identity as rejection of survival itself. That's why some men become irrationally defensive around empathic women. Not because she insulted them, not because she attacked them, but because she unintentionally communicates something terrifying. I see beyond your image. And many people have spent their entire lives hiding behind image. This explains why emotionally shallow attraction often fails with empathic women over time. At first, an empath may appreciate confidence, ambition, success, or charisma. She is still human. But eventually her nervous system starts analyzing emotional consistency beneath the surface. She begins asking deeper questions unconsciously. Does his behavior match his words? Does his confidence disappear? Are under stress? Does his kindness remain when nobody is watching? Does his affection feel safe or transactional? Because an empath is not just observing actions, she is studying emotional intention. And emotional intention is extremely difficult to fake long term. Neuroscientists have discovered that human beings subconsciously detect emotional incongruence through microexpressions, tone variation, body language, and nervous system signaling. Most people ignore these signals consciously. Empaths often don't. Their brains absorb emotional contradictions automatically. That's why emotionally manipulative people often feel exposed around them. A manipulator survives through illusion. The empath disrupts illusion. And this becomes especially threatening to men addicted to status-based attraction because status creates temporary emotional control. Wealth can impress people. Beauty can attract people. Power can influence people. But none of those things guarantee emotional safety, emotional maturity, or authentic connection. And deep down, empaths know that. Modern society has created a dangerous illusion that external success automatically equals emotional worth. Social media intensified this problem dramatically. Studies now show excessive social media exposure increases narcissistic behavior, insecurity, comparison anxiety, and emotional dissatisfaction. Millions of people now build entire identities around curated perception rather than authentic emotional connection. Then an empath walks into the room, and instead of admiring the mask, she studies the exhaustion required to maintain it. That is why empathic women often intimidate men who appear highly confident externally but feel emotionally unstable internally. The empath responds to nervous system energy, not social performance. She can sense when someone is deeply disconnected from themselves, no matter how impressive they appear publicly. And many men secretly hate this because it removes control. A man can control image. He can control appearance. He can control what people know about him. But he cannot easily control what an empath feels from him emotionally. This is why some men obsess over empathic women after rejection, because rejection from an empath feels different psychologically. When superficial attraction fails, the ego can usually recover quickly. But when someone sees beyond your image and still disconnects emotionally, it forces painful self-confrontation. Suddenly the man wonders, if status wasn't enough, then what am I lacking internally? And that question terrifies the ego. Psychologists call this narcissistic injury emotional pain triggered when external validation fails to support self-worth. The brain experiences humiliation, anxiety, and anger because identity structures begin destabilizing. That's why emotionally immature individuals sometimes attack empathic women verbally after emotional rejection. They label her crazy, too emotional, ungrateful, or impossible to satisfy. But those insults often reveal emotional panic more than truth, because the empath challenged the illusion that external success alone creates emotional value, and the deeper reality is even more uncomfortable. Many men who rely heavily on status-based attraction never fully develop emotional intelligence because external validation keeps rewarding emotional avoidance. If attention constantly arrives through money, appearance, or charisma, there is little psychological pressure to confront emotional immaturity internally. Until they meet someone, we immune to superficial performance. That's when emotional weakness becomes visible. And emotional weakness cannot be hidden forever inside intimate relationships. Research consistently shows that long-term relationship satisfaction depends far more on emotional regulation, communication, empathy, trust, and psychological safety than wealth, attractiveness, or social status. In fact, emotionally intelligent couples show lower stress levels, healthier nervous system responses, and greater long-term relationship stability. Because humans are biologically designed for emotional connection, not emotional performance. And this is where female empaths become transformative. They force people to confront the difference between being admired and being emotionally safe. One feeds the ego. The other heals the nervous system. And many people spend their entire lives chasing admiration while starving emotionally underneath. That's why empathic women often feel lonely in modern dating culture. Surface-level attraction is everywhere. Emotional depth is rare. Many people know how to impress others. Few know how to emotionally nourish another human being consistently. The empath notices this quickly. She notices when conversations never move beyond ego. She notices when vulnerability feels rehearsed. She notices when affection disappears the moment admiration stops. And eventually her nervous system becomes exhausted by emotionally empty connections. This is why mature empathic women stop chasing external perfection over time. They begin valuing emotional regulation, calm energy, accountability, consistency, self-awareness, psychological stability. Because they understand something most people learn too late. A beautiful mask cannot comfort you emotionally. Status cannot create intimacy. Charm cannot replace emotional safety. And emotional starvation eventually destroys even the most attractive relationships. But here's the most powerful truth of all. Emotionally healthy men are not threatened by empathic women rejecting superficial value systems. They are relieved by it. Because mature men eventually grow tired of performance too. They understand that peace matters more than image. Connection matters more than ego. Authenticity matters more than admiration. And those are the men who thrive with empathic women. Not the men obsessed with controlly, NG perception, but the men strong enough to exist without hiding behind it. Because the female empath was never searching for the most impressive man in the room. She was searching for the man whose soul still felt real underneath the performance.